to introduce our first presenter, Fenech, the founder of RSI Day, to present on the actual history of RSI Day.
So good morning, everyone. I want to thank the Sudbury Oak-Cow Clinic and especially Trevor for continuing to offer this conference each year, especially during the pandemic. And I'd also like to thank all of you for coming out, because without you, there would be no need for an RSI Day. Sadly, the in-person events that I organized in Toronto have been on hold since the start of the pandemic, so I'm happy to be able to present here. It's hard to believe that this is the 25th annual International Repetitive Strain Injury Awareness Day. For me, this year is another milestone because it's 30 years since I was first injured with RSI, and I've been living with RSI ever since. Unfortunately, I know it's something I'm going to be living with for the rest of my life. My injury stole the life that I had and the life that I'd hoped to build for myself. It ended my career before it even began, but it didn't have to be that way. Caught early and with proper preventions, you can recover from RSI and lead a normal life. And dealing with these injuries alone is bad enough. They're painful, they're debilitating. They can leave you completely helpless. But then you have to deal with all that comes with them. It was a struggle that took a toll on my life. It was a nightmare, both physically and mentally. A lot went wrong in my case, which is why I ended up so badly injured. And that was the impetus for me to start RSI Day, to raise awareness so other people wouldn't go through what all I went through. You can see from this slide, everything was a struggle. And I tried to find a way that I could kind of explain what happened to me, but a lot happened over 30 years. It started with the right wrist tendonitis, and I was sent back to inappropriate modified work. And as I kept working, basically the injury spread to my whole upper body to the point where I couldn't do anything with either arm. I struggled to get healthcare and treatment. And that was a big struggle to find doctors who actually understood these injuries. I sought out healthcare early on, but I was told, just quit your job. It's something I couldn't afford to do, though in hindsight, I might have done better with that short-term, job loss than having a lifetime of pain and disability and ending up not being able to work. I was told to wear a splint, which of course made my injury worse. And eventually I was sent to physiotherapy, but it wasn't appropriate. It just made things worse. So desperate for help, I kept seeking out doctors. And I had one older male doctor told me I just needed to toughen up and take it like a man because pain was part of work. And I said, well, I'm not a man and no one should ever work in pain. He thought I had rheumatoid arthritis, but when the blood tests, and so he thought I was severely disabled until the blood test came back and showed I didn't. And then he said there was nothing wrong with me. One workers' compensation doctor told me to wear a sweater when I told him my arm felt cold and felt dead, like there was no blood in it, which was literally what was happening to me. And another workers' comp doctor told me I needed to go to church and even told me what church I needed to go to, and they got mad at me because I didn't know where it was. And she said there was nothing wrong with me either, just I needed to go to church. Eventually, I found an amazing doctor who was very knowledgeable, who ran a clinic specializing in these injuries, but I couldn't afford the treatment. And by the time my injuries were finally recognized as work-related, I was told by the Workers' Compensation Board that they were permanent, so they weren't going to pay for any treatment. And I couldn't afford the treatment because I was barely working and living in poverty. My savings were running out. And I couldn't work more because I was injured, and I couldn't get better because I couldn't afford the treatment. So I was living in this vicious cycle. The doctors who I did meet, who did understand these injuries, said they did learn this in medical school. And as one doctor told me, in medical school, we learn that muscles are what you cut through to get to organs. I struggled to get compensation. The compensation system was just a nightmare. It wasn't really designed to deal with injuries like this. They were interested in what they recognized. And, when you look through an injured worker's claim file, you can usually predict with RSI where the next injuries are coming from, but they didn't look at that. I struggled to get accommodation. I was sent back to work, and told, like many injured workers, use your other hand, right? You have two. So if my dominant hand was injured doing this work, what did they think was going to happen when I did the same work with my non-dominant hand? You know, my hours were cut at work, my seniority wasn't recognized, I was barely working, but when I complained to the compensation board and asked to be compensated, I was told that's an employment issue. It has nothing to do with your injury. Fortunately, I was unionized, but I spent the next 8 years fighting to be accommodated. I struggled with the pain. I mean, we're talking today about opioids at work. I didn't take opioids, but I many times was struggling at work, icing to keep the swelling down so I could keep going. You know, and after 10 months of doing what I was told was appropriate modified work, my injuries had spread to include my whole upper body. I couldn't do anything with my arms. I was in such pain I could maybe do 5 minutes activity in a day. And it was no longer about work. It was about all those things I couldn't do in my life just to function. I couldn't brush my teeth without having to stop and take a break to rest. Sometimes it was just the stupidest little things that I couldn't do that caused so much pain. Just sitting was painful. And if the professionals that I turned to for help didn't understand these injuries, my friends and families didn't either. And that caused a lot of conflict. I'd always get that. Do you still have that problem? And it didn't help that I was young and I looked healthy. And with no money and being in so much pain, I was no fun to be with. So I lost my friends. It seemed everywhere I turned for help, I got people who didn't understand these injuries. And I was made to feel like this was something new. But guess what? RSI isn't new. The term RSI was fairly new in, you know, the 1990s. I think it started in the 1980 or so. But these injuries were first written about in 1713 by Bernardino Ramazzini, who is considered the father of occupational medicine. And I just included this quote. The incessant driving of pen over paper causes intense fatigue of the hand and the whole arm because of the continuous and almost tonic strain on the muscles and tendons, which in the course of time results in failure of power in the right hand. I think it's just important to know these weren't new injuries. So why was I having so much difficulty finding somebody who actually understood them? These injuries also weren't rare. And I give you some of the statistics we had at the time that, you know, RSI Day was being developed. So getting statistics in Canada can be a little difficult because workers' compensation is a provincial responsibility. And they only report on claims that are allowed. And many of these claims are not allowed. Not all workers are covered, and many don't even file claims. So 1996 to 1997, it was estimated that 1 in 15 Canadians had, over the age of 20, had RSI that interfered with their work or normal activities. By 2000, the first year we did RSI Day, it was 1 in 10 Canadians. So these weren't rare. People should have known more about them. So this slide kind of shows where I was by, I think, 1996. I was in a deep black hole, I called it. It just seemed every time I sought help, people made me feel like it was all in my head, like I was the problem. I was a malingerer. I was somebody who didn't want to work. And, you know, I wish it was all in my head because then I could have fixed it. But it wasn't. I had real physical injuries. And this all took its toll on me mentally and physically. It was a nightmare. And I was living in a dark place. And I remember thinking I was going to become homeless that year because my work had been taken away, my modified work. I was too disabled to do anything else. And I wasn't getting any compensation. And I didn't see a future. I saw nothing. And that's where the black hole comes in. I didn't think I'd live to see the end of 1996. So, oops, let's stay in the black hole. So finally that year, I found help, and that help didn't come from doctors. That help came from my peers, from my local repetitive strain injury support group. And I later joined an RSI support group online called Sorehand that had members from all over the world. And it seemed the common refrain was that we were all on our own looking for help from one another. I mean, my first meeting, I remember listening to people's stories and realizing I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. Everyone else was going through the same thing. All these things that the doctors made me feel like I was making up, these people had experienced. And one of the common things when everybody came to a meeting the first time was, who's your doctor and what job can you do? Because that was what was most important. People wanted to get better, and people wanted to get back to work. And as bad as it was what was happening to me, it was seeing it happen to other people that hurt me even more. And the more I learned about these injuries, the more I wanted to share to prevent other people from going through what I went through. I spoke out, and the more I spoke out, the more people reached out to me. You know, I was interviewed in the media. I was active on, the online RSI support group. And one time I even suggested to an injured worker from Norway who was having issues, I gave him the name of somebody he could contact in Toronto to see if they could refer him to somebody in his country. Next thing I knew, he hopped on a plane and came to Toronto, because that's how desperate he was for help. That in his country, he said he was being told he was crazy, and they had actually tried to commit him because he had lost his voice from using voice recognition software because of trying to compensate for his injuries. I had people call me from across Canada, from across the UK, because they found my name online somewhere. I had unions and legal clinics referring people to me because they didn't know how to deal with them. There was just such a need that people were so desperate for information. And I thought, how do I help all these people? How do we do something on a bigger scale? So, because all these people are struggling after me. And I thought, somebody has to learn from this. We have to stop this. So then one day I was speaking to an injured worker I knew from the San Francisco Bay Area. And she mentioned a news story on RSI where the anchor on the news report was kind of mocking the injury. And I was very familiar with that because I always saw people kind of do that hand gesture of mocking. And I thought at the time, we need to give the media a reason to focus on these injuries, and not in a mocking way. I mean, the only time you usually heard of these injuries, and usually it was carpal tunnel syndrome because that's what people thought was the only injury, it was always as the butt of some joke. Even Seinfeld did an episode where Jerry got carpal tunnel syndrome back in the 90s. So I thought we need to have a day. We need to give the media a reason to focus seriously on this. And suddenly the idea, International Repetitive Strain Injury Awareness Day, came to me. So I typed up a proposal. Probably took me a couple of days to do it because my injuries and I wanted to get it right. This was back in August 1998. And I sent out my email, and it was entitled International Repetitive Strain Injury Awareness Day. I sent this out to the sore hand email list. And right away, I started getting positive responses from people around the world. People were interested. Everyone who responded said to me, RSI is the #1 occupational injury in our country. I was even surprised, some countries where I thought people were a little more laid back, that no, RSI was a big issue. So we formed a planning committee. We set up a separate email list to do the planning. We did it all by email. So our planning committee was made up of injured workers, trade unionists, health and safety professionals, healthcare practitioners, and others. Anybody who had an interest was welcome to join us. We had people there were 15 countries the first year involved. We had people from various countries, Australia, Brazil, Canada, England, Hong Kong, Israel, Italy, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Scotland, Spain, Sweden, and the United States. Which, given this was 1998, I think that was a fairly good reach. So we struggled with various decisions we had to make. What do we call it? Because I know that the term still RSI is controversial. It was then as well. And we voted on everything. We voted by email on everything. So, we considered some of these names. I know the people from Australia had said, hey, we don't use the term RSI anymore. occupational overuse syndrome is what we call it. In the UK, we had people say work-related upper limb disorders. The US was talking cumulative trauma disorder. But at the end of the day, we said, well, who's going to be our primary target? And we said, that's probably your average everyday worker. And we felt RSI was the term that was probably the most well-known. So that was a term we ended up going with. So, and this logo is probably a little different than some you've seen because I've modified it a little. But we had a designer who actually designed a logo for us, and this was the logo. We had to decide what day to do it, you know, because we were trying to organize across the world. For the people, you know, in Australia, we're saying, well, this is summer for us. We'd like to target students. You know, here it's in Canada with the dead of winter. And then you're trying to not conflict with other days. So somebody had proposed February 29th because it's the only non-repetitive day on the calendar. And as it turned out, the year 2000 was a leap year. So choosing February 29th made sense. We voted on it. We agreed on it. So February 29th became the official RSI Day. In non-leap years, it's on the 28th. The slogan, again, was voted on. Somebody came up with because work shouldn't hurt. And I think that really fit well with my experiences of being told, you know, pain is part of work. Then we had to figure out, how do we define the injury? And this was the definition we came back then. We should probably kind of look back at it and review it at some point. So repetitive strain injury, RSI, is an umbrella term for a number of overuse injuries affecting the soft tissues, muscle, tendons, and nerves of the neck, upper and lower body, or lower back, chest, shoulders, arms, and hands, caused by a variety of factors, including repetition, force, and awkward and static postures. Continued. Poor workplace ergonomics and job design are significant factors in the development of these injuries. Typically arising as aches and pains, these injuries can progress to become crippling disorders that prevent sufferers from working or leading normal lives. We also developed a mission statement to address the serious occupational health problem of repetitive strain injury, RSI, by education, by research, and by encouraging all concerned parties to work together towards solutions to return RSI sufferers to health and productivity through prompt and suitable treatment and workplace accommodation. And we had goals. So with our international network, with its network of international planning groups and volunteers, International RSI Day Planning Committee pursues its mission by educating the public about the types of RSI, the risk factors, and how best to prevent, detect, and accommodate and treat RSI, stimulating research to improve prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of RSI, and encouraging participation by workers, employers, unions, healthcare professionals, ergonomists, lawmakers, and other parties concerned in finding solutions to RSI. So we did all this online, and you know, there were many challenges, but I think when you look at those statements, a lot of it encompasses the experiences that I had, and that we wanted to make sure that we included both workers, like prevention, but also the accommodation piece, that we didn't want to forget workers once they were already injured. And in Toronto, we had, you know, local planning, we left up to the individual local groups to do what they wanted, as long as they were consistent with these missions and goals. So, you know, we couldn't dictate what you did, and we felt no event was too big or too small, as long as it did something to further the goals that we had. Some of the challenges: we were volunteers with no resources. Many of us were dealing with our own injuries, and communication was only by email. We had a website set up by somebody in California, and suddenly he stopped responding to emails, and eventually we lost that website, and we lost contact with him. You know, it would have been a lot easier to organize something today, but we were doing this in the late 90s, and again, using email as our only tool. What were the regrets? I think the fact that we still need an RSI Day is one of my regrets. And, you know, the first year we started out in Ontario looking for an ergonomic regulation. We held a press conference at Queen's Park, and we've called on the government many times over the years for that, and that we don't have it. But I'm grateful that, now we have this platform through OCal that I can be speaking here today to people in 43 different countries. And that's something I would never have envisioned when we started RSI Day. So this was a cake we had on our 20th RSI Day. Don't have cake for this year, but I want to congratulate and thank all of you for coming out and for participating in RSI Day, because I think it's so important that we continue to do this and to continue to spread the word about these injuries that are preventable, that nobody needs to suffer the way I did. Nobody needs to spend a lifetime in pain because of injuries that are preventable. And just, in closing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about we're talking today about the opioid epidemic and opioids and RSI. And I think that's a really important subject. I chose not to take the pain path, the pill path when dealing with my injuries. I actually wanted treatment. And the reason we have an opioid epidemic is because of our failure to treat chronic pain properly. Nobody wanted to give me treatment, right? I had to fight and fight, and I actually paid for out of pocket for my treatment and I tried to get compensated after. Everyone expects us to pop a pill and to be better. Pop a pill, get back to work. And that was one of the things that was used against me throughout my journey, was that I didn't take pills. Even as recently as last year, I was fighting Canada Pension Plan Disability. And they were saying in every submission against me was saying, she doesn't take pills. She can't be disabled. She can't be in pain. She's not taking any medication. I had the Workers' Compensation Board use that against me as well. I wasn't taking medication. And I was lucky. I had a doctor, a good doctor, who supported that, who believed in actual treatment that would make me better instead of masking my pain. Because with these injuries, your pain is your body's way of telling you to stop. And I've learned over the years that I have to listen to my body. I can't mask my pain. My pain is telling me to stop. And if I don't listen to it, I will get further and further injured. So I think it's really important that we're talking about that today. And I want to, again, thank you all for coming out, and thank you for Trevor for putting on this event once again. And thank you for 25 years of RSI Day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine.